Children of the Stones by Jeremy Burnham and Trevor Ray. Chapter 3. Hendrik was as good as his word. Next day, when Matthew left the cottage weighed down by a breakfast of eggs, gherkins, and chocolate cake, Bob was waiting for him. Matthew smiled. This time, he would get in first. "Happy day," he called. Surprisingly, Bob didn't respond. He stared at him for a moment, looking puzzled. "You're not supposed to—" He stopped abruptly. "Not supposed to what?" "Nothing. Come on, you mustn't be late on your first day." They cycled off, speeding through the narrow, winding streets to the edge of the village. The schoolhouse was an old, converted rectory with thick, diamond-patterned windows. Compared with Matthew's school, a modern, airy building, it looked dark and forbidding. Inside, however, the atmosphere was cozy and informal, more like a large sitting room than a classroom. On one side, at a long, polished table, most of the class sat silently, waiting for the arrival of the teacher. On the other, 3 or 4 children sat at makeshift desks composed of armchairs and coffee tables, noisily throwing paper darts at each other. The contrast between the two groups was startling. Bob pointed to one of the desks on the noisy side of the room. "You should sit there for a moment." He moved off to an empty chair at the long table. Matthew noticed Sandra, the girl who'd kept staring at him the day before, among the rowdy group. As hers was the only face he recognized, he started to walk toward her. But the ground under his feet suddenly seemed to move, and before he knew what was happening, he found himself full length on the floor. He looked around, dazed and bewildered. One of the dart-throwing boys was grinning down at him, a cheeky face, not unfriendly. "So, new boy, what are you going to do about that?" Matthew knew exactly what to do about it. He had to take the same sort of action many times before. "Break your leg," he said cheerfully. He grabbed the boy's foot and twisted, bringing him crashing to the floor. Before he had time to recover, Matthew was on top of him, pinioning his arms. The boy heaved through Matthew sideways and grabbed his hair. Matthew punched him in the stomach and grabbed him around the waist. They rolled over and over, each trying to gain a decisive hold. "Stop it! Both of you!" The voice was full of authority, and the two boys released each other, startled. Sandra was looking down at them with contempt. "You ought to be ashamed of yourselves. Especially you, Kevin, attacking him the moment he walks through the door." Kevin picked himself up and dusted his trousers. "I was just testing." "Testing what? To see if he was human." Sandra frowned. "Of course he's human. He only arrived yesterday." "Good. One of us, then." He turned, offered his hand to Matthew, and pulled him to his feet. "Sorry about that, but we had to be sure." Matthew rubbed his bruised elbow. "Sure of what?" "That you weren't one of them." Kevin jerked his head, indicating the group around the table. They were sitting as still as statues and as quiet as mice. Matthew stared at the row of expressionless faces. "One of them?" "Don't be silly, Kevin," Sandra broke in quickly. "He doesn't know the difference." She and Kevin took their places at the improvised desks. Matthew followed slowly, wondering what on earth they had been talking about. He hadn't understood a word. As he sat down, the door opened and Miss Clegg entered. She looked around, smiling. "Happy day, children!" There was a chorus from the group at the table. "Happy day, Mrs. Clegg!" Matthew noticed that Sandra, Kevin, and the boy sitting next to him did not join in. Miss Clegg moved behind her desk. "Now, before we begin, I would like you to welcome a new member of the class. Stand up, Matthew." Reluctantly, Matthew got to his feet. The children at the table were looking at him with polite interest, as if he were an insect under a microscope. "This is Matthew Brake," Miss Clegg went on, who is joining us for a few weeks. Matthew's father is an astrophysicist. Anyone know what that involves? Bob's hand shot up. Yes, Bob. The study of matter and energy in relation to the stars, miss. Miss Clegg turned to Matthew, still smiling. Correct, Matthew? Yes, miss. Good. You can sit down now. Matthew sat back in his armchair, grateful he was no longer the center of attention. Miss Clegg clasped her hands behind her back and walked slowly forward till she was standing in front of Sandra's desk. Anyone have problems with the work I sent you yesterday? 3 hands went up. Sandra, Kevin, and the fat boy next to him who looked like he had problems with everything. Miss Clegg didn't seem at all surprised. Bob, she's called. Would you show us how you solved it? Bob crossed to the blackboard and wrote down the most complicated mathematical equation Matthew had ever seen. He was very good at figures, having been taught well by his father. But this was way beyond his reach. He watched with amazement and admiration as Bob resolved the problem quickly and efficiently, the chalk flying across the blackboard. It was an incredible feat for someone of his age. Matthew turned to find Sandra watching him intently. How do you explain that? She seemed to be saying, obviously sharing his bewilderment. Bob finished the equation and sat down, an expression of quiet satisfaction on his face. It wasn't arrogance or conceit, just pride at a job well done. Kevin looked sourly at the long list of symbols on the blackboard and let out a loud raspberry. He, for one, didn't seem impressed. Miss Clegg ignored him. She walked up to the blackboard and wiped it clean. Now I must look after our other friends, she announced to the group at the table. So here's something else to be thinking about. She wrote down another equation which Matthew found just as impossible to understand. But the group at the table seemed to have no such difficulty. They bent over their exercise books and began to work industriously. Matthew copied down the figures and stared at them. An equation, he knew, was a statement of equality between known and unknown quantities. But what happened when they were all unknown quantities? How do you begin? He put up his hand. Miss Clegg. Miss Clegg moved to peer over his shoulder. Not you, Matthew. We'll start you on something else, shall we, just to see how you get on. Some of us even have difficulty with the simple stuff, don't we, Sandra? Sandra frowned. Yes, miss. Miss Clegg turned to the boy next to Kevin and ruffled his hair. What about you, Jimmo? No good asking to see your book, I suppose. She picked up his exercise book and leafed through it, shaking her head sadly. No. Figures are not your strong point, are they, Jimmo? I don't suppose you could even tell me what 1 and 1 make? A crafty smile spread over Jimmo's plump face. My dad's a farmer, miss, he said unexpectedly. Miss Clegg looked taken aback. What's that got to do with it? I'll probably follow him, miss. So? Well, on a farm you put 1 and 1 together and you usually get a third. Kevin hooted with laughter, curling up in his armchair. Miss Clegg surveyed him coolly. You find that funny, Kevin? Kevin stopped laughing, sat up straight, and bit his lip nervously. Sorry, miss. Miss Clegg contemplated him in silence for a moment and then walked over and picked up his exercise book. Nothing to laugh about here, is there? Seems we've drawn another blank. She moved back to Matthew and laid the open exercise book on his desk. Think you can do better, Matthew? Matthew looked at the figures with relief. Here was something he could understand, a simple equation he could solve without too much difficulty. He felt like a ship, back in harbor, after sailing on uncharted seas. He set to work, his logical mind taking him easily from step to step until the answer emerged, a golden nugget of truth. Wordlessly, he handed the book back to Miss Clegg. She glanced at it and nodded, obviously pleased. "Well done! I can see it won't take you long to catch up." "Catch up? With the others?" Matthew looked doubtfully at the children at the high table. "I don't know about that, miss. I think they're a bit above my standard. At the moment, perhaps, but there's no knowing what you'll achieve once you've—" She stopped abruptly, as if she'd already said too much. Matthew waited for her to continue, but she made no effort to complete the sentence. "Once of what, miss?" he prompted. "Once you've settled down." He had the feeling that was not what she was going to say, but before he could question her further, she had moved away. "Anyone finished?" she asked, addressing the clever group. A forest of hands shot up. Kevin groaned. And when Matthew turned, he again found Sandra's eyes on him. He had never met anyone who stared so much. When Adam arrived at the museum, he found Margaret typing at her desk near a stack of filing cabinets. All around her were glass cases filled with fossils and relics of every description, pieces of rock, flint, and pottery, all neatly labeled. On the walls were several maps and photographs showing how Milbury had developed from a primitive settlement to a 20th century village. Behind the desk was a reproduction of the artist's drawing in the guidebook. "Good morning." Adam picked his way through the maze of exhibits, wondering how she would reply. Margaret took off the horn-rimmed spectacles she was wearing and smiled. "Good morning." "Not happy day?" "Definitely not." "Thank heavens for that. It's getting on my nerves." Her smile faded. "And you've only been here 24 hours. Wait till you've been here a week." She replaced her spectacles and began to type again, banging the keys savagely. Adam had to shout to make himself heard. "Sounds more like a password than a greeting." She paused, glanced up at him over the top of her glasses. "Yes." This was said with such emphasis that Adam was convinced she was trying to convey some message to him. He waited for her to continue, but she seemed to think she had made herself clear. She returned to the typewriter, bashing at the machine as if it had insulted her. Adam watched her for a moment, then moved away and started to wander around the room, studying the various charts on the walls. There was one that looked particularly intriguing. It was a large-scale ordnance survey map of the area, showing the village and the stone circle. A network of lines had been drawn on it, radiating out from the circle, like the spokes of a wheel. Behind him, the sound of the typewriter suddenly stopped. "Know what these are?" Adam peered at the map. "No?" "Lee lines." He turned and stared at her in astonishment. He knew all about Lee lines. Invisible cables that were supposed to connect places of ancient sanctity. He had always dismissed the theory as being the invention of a few lunatics with more imagination than sense. And Margaret certainly didn't seem to fit in that category. "Don't tell me you believe in all that mumbo-jumbo." Her face was impassive. "I try to keep an open mind." "Oh, come on. Lines connecting churches, markstones, barrows, and so on." "And stone circles." So she was serious. He would have to tread carefully. He didn't want to offend her. "My idea of hell," he smiled, trying to lighten the atmosphere. "Write out 100 Lee lines." But there was no answering smile. "I take it you're not a believer," she said coolly. Adam sighed. There was nothing for it. If their relationship was to develop, he would have to be honest. "I'm a scientist," he said quietly. Scientists need proof. I can't offer you that, I'm afraid. She rose and crossed over to join him, staring thoughtfully at the map. There are some interesting stories, though. Tell me. Well, some people believe that the sacred places along these lines are temples built as storehouses of psychic energy by Neolithic man. This was too much. She was an extremely attractive woman, but Adam could no longer hide his skepticism. So, Millbury's full of psychic energy, is it? She glanced at him, then looked away as if ashamed of her gullibility. It's full of something. He had no idea what she was talking about, but he decided not to press it further. If she chose to believe that the village was the center of some Neolithic grid system, then nothing he could say would change her mind. He tried another tack. Who traced all these Lee lines? Various Lee hunters. There are people who spend all their spare time looking for them. Some I worked out for myself. And how many are there? 53. Adam frowned. That's interesting. Why? There are 53 standing stones left in the circle. She turned to face him, gazing solemnly into his eyes. You think that's a coincidence? They were back on dangerous ground. It was time to change the subject. How long have you been here? He asked, wandering down the rows of glass cases. Margaret, too, seemed glad to avoid an argument. Seems like ages, she said, moving briskly back to her desk and putting the cover on the typewriter. But it's hardly been any time at all. A month? 6 weeks? First time you've curated, is it? The first time I've had to earn my own living. She stood for a moment, lost in her own thoughts, then, as if to dismiss any suggestion of self-pity, she produced a bright smile. Luckily, I had a degree in archaeology, so when my husband died, I had some sort of qualification to fall back on. Adam sat on the edge of her desk. And you enjoy the work? The work? Oh, yes. Again, the suggestion of something left unsaid. So, what aren't you enjoying? She sat down, picked up a pencil, and started to play with it, turning it over and over with her nervous fingers. I don't enjoy being alone. Adam sensed her need. He, too, had experienced loneliness in the 2 years since his wife had died. Of course not, he said sympathetically. When you lose someone who's been a part of you. You don't understand. She dropped the pencil and sat forward, her tone suddenly sharp and urgent. You haven't been here long enough. Adam frowned. You mean the natives are unfriendly? I mean, I'm glad you're here. She stretched out her hand, and he took it, surprised at the desperation in her voice. She seemed not so much lonely as frightened. Adam, she said softly, will you do something for me? Of course. Touch one of the stones. Why? I just want to see if you're the kind of man I think you are. The conversation was becoming so bizarre that Adam wanted to laugh, but her expression told him it was no laughing matter, as far as she was concerned. He must continue to humor her. And what sort of man is that? He asked. She rose, tightened her grip on his hand, and started to pull him toward the door. Please, come with me. Please. Adam allowed himself to be dragged out of the museum, wondering what on earth he was letting himself in for. Had he fallen into the clutches of the madwoman of Millbury? If so, he decided he didn't mind all that much. He found her clutches decidedly pleasant. School was over for the day, but Matthew still sat at his desk, watching the high-table children file quietly out of the classroom. They were so well-behaved it was ridiculous, not like any other kids he met. At his old school, there was absolute pandemonium as soon as the final bell rang. But for all the noise this lot made, they might have been monks who had taken vows of silence. He stood up, collected his books together, and stowed them in his satchel. "Come on," said a voice from the doorway. He looked up to find Sandra waiting for him. "What's the hurry? Don't you want to get out of here?" She looked around the room with distaste. "This place gives me the creeps." "Why?" "Because of them, of course." She jerked her head over toward the empty chairs at the long table, turned, and marched out. Matthew followed thoughtfully, conscious of a sense of relief as he walked through the door. He suddenly realized how oppressive the atmosphere inside the classroom had been. A group of boys was clustered around the school bulletin board in the hall. Matthew peered over their heads to see what they were looking at. "The football team," Sandra explained. "There's a match on Saturday." They were about to move on when Kevin pushed his way from the center of the group, blocking their path. His face was flushed with anger. "I've been dropped," he announced incredulously. "She's actually had the nerve to drop me." Bob appeared at his elbow. "What'd you expect?" he asked softly. "What did I expect?" Kevin whirled around on him, glad of someone on whom he could vent his wrath. "I scored a hat trick in the last match. I certainly didn't expect to be given the push." "You argued with the ref," said Bob imperturbably. "That's no way to be happy." Kevin snorted with derision. "How could I be happy with that center back going for my legs all the time, and the ref took no notice?" "Perhaps he was nearsighted." "Then he should wear contact lenses." Bob shrugged. "Well, you told him what you thought of him. Did it make you feel better?" Kevin raised his fist and held it in front of Bob's face. "I'll tell you what would have made me feel better." Bob didn't flinch. "Go on then. Thump me." Kevin's fist crashed into his chin. Bob staggered back, hit his head on the wall, and slumped to the ground. The boys drew back, forming a ring around the two contestants, and Matthew waited for the inevitable fight to begin. Bob was considerably bigger than Kevin, and if he really punched his weight, it would be a massacre. But, surprisingly, he made no effort to retaliate. He picked himself up, rubbed the back of his head, and grinned. "You see?" he said pleasantly. "Didn't solve anything, did it?" He turned and walked away. Kevin, who had braced himself for battle, slowly lowered his fists. "Chicken!" he called. "Happy little chicken!" "Don't be silly, Kevin," said Sandra quietly. "You know that's not true." Matthew stared at her. "What is true?" he asked. "He just doesn't believe in fighting." "None of them do." "Why not?" "Because it doesn't make them happy." They walked out into the yard, collected their bicycles, and set off side by side toward the village. There were so many questions Matthew wanted to ask, but he got the impression that Sandra was as puzzled as he was. She seemed to be waiting for him to provide the answers. He decided to cycle around the stone circle to see if his father had begun his field work. He might be able to make himself useful, copying down the magnetometer readings. "I'm going to take a look at the stones," he said to Sandra as they reached the crossroads. "See you tomorrow." She raised her arm in acknowledgement and disappeared down the winding lane that led to the museum. Matthew turned left, bent low over the handlebars, and started to pedal as fast as he could, the winner of the Tour de France approaching the finishing line in Paris. As Adam and Margaret walked toward the stones, she told him what was known about them from the archaeological point of view. "They're undressed Sarsens," she explained, "weighing approximately 40 tons each. There were 100 in the original circle, of which 53 now remain. 2 avenues of stone used to extend from the circle, one to the southeast, which terminates in the linnet barrow on the hill called the Hackpin, or the Serpent's Head, also known as the Sanctuary, and the others to the southwest, which no longer exists. These avenues form the head and tail of the solar serpent, the symbol of the inner truth. Adam looked at her with undisguised admiration. Bravo! She smiled. Not bad for a beginner? You're a walking encyclopedia. Not really. I've just got a good memory. A gray shape loomed massively above them. Adam stopped and stared up at it thoughtfully. 40 tons, eh? Wouldn't like to be caught under that. Margaret shuddered. Someone was caught. Centuries ago. A barber surgeon was helping to bury one of the stones when it fell over and crushed him to death. His skeleton's in the museum. Poor chap. When was he found? Earlier this century. They re-erected the sarsen, and there he was underneath. Adam tried to imagine what it must have been like to look up and realize, for one horrifying split second, that the huge rock was about to fall. Why were they burying it? He asked. Local superstition. The villagers believed that if they buried one of the stones each year, it would bring them luck. Didn't do the barber surgeon much good, did it? She put a hand on his arm. So when you start messing about out here, be careful. He laughed. Don't worry. I'll ask my son to keep watch for me. Her expression didn't change. What exactly do you intend to do? Well, first of all, a bit of electronic dowsing. Try and find where the missing stones are. You don't need to dowse. She waved her hand toward the rest of the circle. There are concrete posts marking their positions. I like to do my own research, and I like playing with expensive sonic equipment. Now, you said you wanted me to touch one of these things. Yes. She stepped back, as if expecting an explosion. Just touch it. That's right. He shrugged, stretched out his hand, and touched the rock. Completely unprepared for the sudden, excruciating pain that shot up his arm, welding his hand to the stone, he shut his eyes and gritted his teeth, trying to break the contact, but it was no use. The pain seemed to pass through his whole body, transfixing him to the spot. He couldn't move. He couldn't think. He couldn't see. Yes, he could see. He could see Matthew's picture. And it was as if the ring of shadowy figures had been shocked into life by the current. They were raising their arms in protection against the bright pillar of light in the center and turning to flee into the surrounding dark. He felt himself falling down and down into the same darkness, whirling around and around in a whirlpool of night. Then at last, no pain, no sensation of any kind, nothing.